Earlier you made a comment about how bankruptcy, the goal is to break contracts, and I wonder if somewhere along the way we've broken a really important social contract um, with regard to what makes our citizens and our residents healthy and prosperous. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to frame it. But you only have a social contract if you recognize people as human beings, right? And I think the sort of dehumanization that has gone on, historically, the tropes you've talked about through regional racism, the failure to look at this historic legacy of spatial structural racism as the root cause of inequality. If you want to know the most simple reason why it's been so hard to get policy change is because there's a very strong counter narrative based upon sort of a false meritocracy and the trope of individualism and not systems thinking. And that's that notion that these people didn't pay their bills, right? And there's a whole psychology with that. So if you don't pay your bill, you're blameworthy, right? If you're blameworthy, you're deserving of punishment, right? The punishment here is that we're going to shut your water off, and it's going to hurt me a whole lot more than it's going to hurt you, but it's going to be good for you, right? And that becomes the psychology of the people who read the newspaper and see the story on the evening news. That becomes the psychology of the emergency manager. And the inability to break through that narrative, which is one based on this false notion of meritocracy and this American tradition of individual blame and punishment, really is the core of why the needle has not moved in terms of the water shutoff debate, right? And so you keep brainstorming, how do you deal with that, right? And you remember back about, is the economy stupid? Well, the equivalent of that is, nobody voluntarily lives without water, right? Nobody voluntarily lives without water. So this notion that these people are out there spending money on all sorts of different things because they don't want to drink water or have a bath, that is a false reality, right? And yet it becomes very difficult to counter that as a matter of narrative, right? As a matter of changing that psychology. And it's important to note how that individual sort of narrative is mirrored in the broader notion of the emergency manager, right? So here what you're saying is, look at this city, right? The city is in municipal distress. We told you these people couldn't govern themselves. They're blameworthy, right? So therefore now the city can be punished. And the punishment there is emergency management, which has all sorts of sexist, paternalistic overtones as well, that daddy's going to come in and clean everything up. And then the punishment becomes these very draconian forms of fiscal austerity, that we're going to give you different and lower sets of city services, right? And we're going to let the zip code that you're born in determine for future generations in this region what opportunity that you are going to have available for you. And then if you don't succeed after not having the available opportunity, we're going to blame you for not working hard enough, right? And we see that we're just chasing our tail again over and over.
So I do know of efforts currently on the ground. One of the groups, I think it's Detroit Youth for Justice, that is especially trying to canvass residents and groups in Oakland County to try to find out their knowledge of the Detroit water shutoffs and try to understand some of the psychological blocks. Our project, actually, earlier on, we did a series of interviews with both suburban and Detroit residents who were not affected, because we really wanted to understand what are these narratives that resituate this privilege, right? And by and large, our empirical data essentially backs up a lot of what you're saying in terms of personal responsibility being a really key discourse, focusing on your own individual collective bubble, community bubble, for instance. But despite that, we also found instances where some people were saying we need to make allowances and exceptions for if you really can't pay, then you should be allowed to still have water. If you're a senior citizen, you should still, regardless, be allowed to have water. If there are kids at home, you should still be allowed to have access to water. So from your perspective, do you think this narrative of, yes, individualism, but yes, there should be exceptions, is that helpful, or do you think it still perpetuates this broader individualism?
It's complicated, right? I think you want to be moving to frames that honor the systems-based nature of the analysis, right? So, and I believe a public health frame helps do that, right? So, one of the few entities that sort of has a public tinge to it was originally, when it was created, was the Detroit Wayne County Health Authority. Changed its names to Authority Health, which sounds scary to me, but in essence the same group. But that group for a number of years maintained what they called the Population Health Council. And in my mind, that was one of the more interesting and sophisticated groups of people who came together on a quarterly basis to look at the issues of Detroit and the region through a lens of public health. And I think, I could be wrong, there could be others, but they passed a resolution that was arguing for a series of public health exceptions to the water shutoffs that mirror what you're talking about, but not in the punitive sense. Basically saying that because we believe that public health is important, because we want to preserve and maintain and promote the public health, there should be a public health exception to the water shutoffs if there's a medically needy person in the house, if there are senior citizens in the house, if there are pregnant women in the house, if there are children in the house, right? And I think that was one of the ways to be pushing back against this sort of personal responsibility and individual narrative, as well as I say, trying to leverage a group that had some legitimacy in terms of being a public entity or sanctioned by public entities, to be standing up and saying what is right and what is wrong, and what is promoting the public health and what is denying the public health. The other effort I would point to is this effort to try to use back to empirical research, right? And just as it took empirical research, which was originally citizen-driven and not university-driven in Flint, to tell the story about lead, to create it in a frame that somehow legitimated a public action in ways that just rotten water that is causing rashes and people's hair to fall out didn't, right? Was to then say, well, let's prove what we all knew as kids, that water is essential to life, right? And there was, again, a collective effort, which included the Global Health Initiative at Henry Ford Hospital, to try to document, right, by using emergency room data and looking at people, whether they came from a block that had water shutoffs, and demonstrating, again, what every high school biology student knows, that if you came from a block that had a water shutoff, you had a higher instance of a soft tissue infection, right? And if you came to the emergency room with a soft tissue infection, you were much more likely to come from a block that had water shutoffs, right? And even at that preliminary stage, you start to connect the dots in a way that says, wow, right, this is not just an individual story. This is a story that's affecting entire neighborhoods, right, entire groups. And then the power structure comes down, and that study, right, knowledge, research, academics, studies, was basically squelched, right? And people were forbidden to talk about it, right? And this is a democracy, so they say.
What is the role, as a fellow academic, what is the role of academics in this, in situations like this? Can you describe how you yourself have sort of tried to engage with different community groups and members on the ground? And what are the obstacles and challenges that you faced? Because we're going through something quite similar, but of course you've had so much of a head start.
Yeah.
So maybe could you reflect a little bit on your journey as a engaged scholar, activist, whichever label that you'd like to adopt?
Yeah, I think you have to have different gears you can work within, right? I think there's one way academics can be very helpful by being in their expert gear, right? They have specialized body of knowledge. They can bring that specialized body of knowledge to bear, and then they can try to inform understanding and policy, right? And that really is one of the things that also just tremendously troubled and shocked me, right? is we were going around trying to make this public health case, right? Nobody stepped forward, right? You couldn't get an emergency room doctor to tell you that water was necessary for health. You couldn't find people at our public health schools, right, including a leading public health school down I-94, to be coming out and saying what again, high school biology students know, but would give that monitor sort of expertise to say, yes, mass water shutoffs really are a serious public health problem. Water really is necessary for life. So I would say that the medical professionals, medical schools, public health professionals, public health schools, public health academics have a huge black eye in not stepping forward and using their basic expertise to inform policy decisions, right? There are different gears again, right? So a lot of the work that we do in the Keith Center, and I think exemplified in the Detroit Equity Action Lab or the DEAL, is an effort to try to work collaboratively with community, right? And there what you're trying to do is be enabling and catalytic of the work that is happening in community, trying to build stronger coalitions, trying to help collaborative undertakings, trying to provide the assistance that you're told that people need, right? And be very sort of thoughtful about how decisions are made, whose leadership is being respective, how you are working within that kind of coalition. And we were doing that as well, and worked with just a number of tremendously dedicated, talented, thoughtful, hardworking people that kept running into that wall, no matter how hard they fought, right? In terms of trying to change this policy, trying to get exceptions, trying to get this notion of water affordability, trying to think creatively about how you could redesign rate structures, and to me, it's been the most frustrating issue that I've worked on in coalition with folks, because the need is so obvious, right? In my mind, sort of self-evident, right? The evil, the harm is so clear. The work that has been done has been heroic, right? And the policy hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm. Why hasn't the policy changed in your opinion?
As I come back, I think it gets many different reasons, right? At one level, when you look at a complex system that keeps producing a result, right, one say, well, the system's broken, right? Another way to look at it is say, well, the system's doing exactly what it wants, right? And I think, again, if you're going back to that frame of 5-7 years, right, that it was the leading into emergency management, leading into the bankruptcy, leading to the water shutoffs, there were a number of complementary policies that were all having the effect of mass displacement, right? Water shutoffs, mass displacement, right? The closing of 100+ public schools associated with mass displacement, the tax foreclosures, right? Which had a very conscious element not to be adjusting the assessed value as the market fell. So a key driver of the tax foreclosures, and why you get the name of the coalition to stop of illegal tax foreclosures, is that another conscious decision was made to try to beef up revenue by keeping property taxes higher, even though it ultimately led to the foreclosure of tens of thousands of people's homes, right? And I think it's worth thinking about as we're hearing this broader narrative of Renaissance Detroit, Detroit rebirth, that people are permitting mass displacement to take place because they don't see a Detroit future city that has room for poor black folk, right? And until somebody can disprove that by showing why all these awful decisions actually make good sense, right, and are good public policy, I think we have to maintain the sort of dystopic vision of these policies either willfully or through blind neglect permitting forms of mass displacement to continue as being one of the leading explanations of why you haven't had action on tax foreclosures or water shutoffs, right? So I think that's part of it. I also think that, as we said before, that systems analysis runs into individual analysis, and that there's sort of a broader sort of political psychology at play that we need to be working at. And then just as this notion that Flint lives don't matter, and that's why you could poison Flint, but you could never poison Ann Arbor, right? Is coming back to the same sort of notion that people really don't think Black lives matter, right? That these lives are not valued. And that's part of the analysis that says why I can be in a majority Black city and shut off tens of thousands of households of water and not care.
So mass displacement is the goal.
Again, they're complicated, right? And anytime you're dealing with a system and a complex system, having a goal, right? Having a unitary answer, having a form of intent becomes complicated, right? And that's why I said before, to me, it hasn't been disproven that it's not a goal, right? I think that's a live hypothesis. But I think there's this whole continuum of this notion of intending it to happen. There's another continuum of knowing it's happening and not acting. And that clearly is you can document that as being true. These are happening and people are not acting to stop it, right? And then you can reinterpret how you approach intent, right? And this was one of the brilliant things that Judge Keith did. And the Pontiac busing case was one of the areas. That if you know this is what is happening and you have public responsibility and you don't fix the problem, you have intended that, right? So I think we have to also be moving to a more aggressive understanding of what intent is. And if you are publicly charged with responsibility and you fail to act in light of that responsibility, then you should be hung around your neck, right? Responsibility for the social evil that has taken place, and you should not be able to avoid responsibility, right? And I think that very well details the water shutoffs, the people who are running the water system, the city council that has not aggressively tried to act, the mayor who has stood aside and let this continue, right? Each one of those has the ability to take steps that would ameliorate the problem. They are not taking those steps. It's fair to put responsibility on their plate for that failure.
The concerns of mass displacement and gentrification are those that I think are very real, especially in communities like Brightmoor and the North End, where we have engaged both organizers and residents, because both of those neighborhoods I have seen like major shutoffs for sometimes ridiculously low amounts of bills unpaid, sometimes into 10 cents, 38 cents. At the same time, you see within those communities, you've got these, brand new spanking urban farms and new schools and houses being bought and rebought and fixed. And so these are concerns that we hear actually from the residents and organizers on the ground as well. What sort of data, I guess, or knowledge points, I guess, would be useful to definitively say that we're sort of wise to your game, your long-term game of because this is what the goal is, to basically turn over residents, to turn over the neighborhood, to reshape the city as need be. What sort of knowledge or data do you think?
I think the mass displacement should speak for itself, right? I think you can point to mass displacement. And that mass displacement is taking place in a setting where there are policy alternatives, right? That's why I thought it was very important that we were advocating for a grander bargain, right? That would lead to a more equitable form of the entire water system. If people are saying that I can't do anything, that's one scenario. If you're putting there and saying, well, let's dust off this 10-year-old water affordability plan, right, that has substantial empirical and analytic support before it, and let's look at adopting that, right? I also think there's a trap of falling into the expert paradigm of data. And I think I've alluded to that before. Sometimes that can be manipulated and worked. Sometimes if you say, well, I've got to figure out how to prove it, right? And the proving it was a key part of the Henry Ford study, right? Because there's power in that. So I'm not saying that there isn't power in data and analysis, but I also think you have to be careful of the broader sort of policy and rhetorical frame that you're implicating as well, right? So, for example, when the water shutoffs were just starting, right? This was not long after the Detroit Future City report had come out, and people were very interested in trying to see, is there any correlation between the location and intensity of the water shutoffs and the neighborhoods that were deemed viable and neighborhoods that were not deemed viable. So there were efforts to do both mapping and try to do some statistical analysis to see whether that was so. And the truth was that the water shutoffs were everywhere. Right, and some people were looking at that saying, well, that just proves that Detroit Future City is not the governing template, or I think the better answer is saying that proves the theory of mass displacement. That there's at least two policy instruments going on. One might be dedicated to try to implement this sort of shifting little puzzle pieces to re-engage the city around neighborhoods that are deemed as viable. At the same time, that this narrative of mass displacement is coming through. Right? I think that Professor Bernadette Atuahena has done his heroic work with her and her co-authors to document through data the nature of the tax foreclosure, right, and to put responsibility of that at the doorstep of policymakers, right. So I think there's a lot of data that tells the narrative, and you know, look how far the queue line goes. Right, that tells you how far people are invested in Detroit from a downtown perspective. Right, some other important data just comes in this notion of whether or not you can get a commercial mortgage to buy a home. Right, and Bridge Magazine recently came out with a story with a series of overlying maps about what neighborhoods were getting loans, what are not, and that's going to much more closely correlate with the Detroit Future City template of viable versus not viable, as well as race factors that start to show that the loans were going in the more viable, right, settings that are going to receive public subsidies and investments and support and infrastructure. And that those loans were going disproportionately to white applicants in a majority black city, right? So you go downtown and you look at who's eating in the restaurant, right? Even more so, you look downtown and you don't even find African Americans in the workplace, right? And you're finding this sort of notion of whether it's anecdotally or whether you're looking at demography or you're looking at different forms of data, the writing is in my mind very clearly on the walls, and yet it doesn't change policy. And then you come back to that notion that if a system is producing a certain outcome in a persistent way, that the system really is probably designed to produce that outcome. Right? And if a system's producing gentrification and mass displacement, the system isn't broken. Right? The system's doing what the system is intended to do. And that's why you need these broader, deeper critiques to be looking at this through a lens of spatial structural racism, to connect that to the forms of historic inequalities, and to use that as kind of a benchmark to then be making a normative assessment, right, through a metric of racial equity to say, is this right? Right? And that opens up a very different discussion.
Tell me a little bit about once you do your analysis and you create a report or a piece or a publication, what happens to it? How do you then convey it, to the hands of the powers that be? So tell me a little bit about that process of translating your work for policymakers or broader community members.
Yeah, and there's no magic bullet and there's no single formula. And one of the difficulties, given how quickly things have and are changing and the number of crises that people in Detroit are facing, the time frame that it takes to do a thoughtful analysis often is longer and slower than the underlying nature of the shifting problems and the shifting crises. Right, and so there's a way in which you're always playing catch up, right? Or there are ways in which people need to be sort of more thoughtful about what is the output, right? If I think of just things that we've done here at the center and kind of analyses or reports, the critique that we did of Detroit Future City, I think, had a significant impact, right? And that basically was one talk at Marygrove College, right? And I was so busy I couldn't even write it up. So you can't even find that in written form, although you find bits and pieces of it and other things that I've written, right? But that hit in a time when it was relevant. That was basically telling people what they already knew, which is a great way to convince them. There's no great insights there that people that looked at the report, went through the process, didn't already know, but what was not happening is nobody was saying it, right? And I think that made a difference. I was on the short list of people interviewed by Judge Rhodes to do an economic evaluation of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment, right? And I didn't get the job. Not a big surprise, but where they paid millions of dollars to get their report, I wrote a free critique of their report in the form of an open letter to Judge Rhodes. It was subsequently published in our Journal of Law and Society here at Wayne State Law School. I thought that was a very important analysis, right? Didn't have any impact at all, right? And it didn't have any impact because the number of political forces lining up to say, don't question the bankruptcy, don't rock the boat, doesn't matter how good the analysis is, how troubled the expert report is, how much this was thrown together, how little we actually know about what's going on. There was no audience for that, right? At least within the ranges of what people were in a position to have influence. And in fact, the whole dynamics of that process was get it done quick, don't ask questions, get it done quick, don't ask questions, right? And so the mismatch between a deep analysis and a quickly moving target that doesn't want to be introspective meant that didn't have any impact, right? And then I would contrast two other things that we've produced in terms of analyses. I wrote another sort of lengthy analysis of the fate of the Detroit public schools, and that was done maybe 7-8 years ago, right? That didn't have any quick kind of rapid change in policy, but I did think that had a pretty substantial impact on the way that subsequent efforts to reform the process, including the Coalition for the Future of Detroit School Children, looked at it, right? So I think that helped define for a period of years what the appropriate way was to frame the understanding of what was happening in the public schools and what was wrong and what were the kinds of things that would start to move us in a better direction. And one of the most gratifying things I've had as an academic is a woman who's was just a mother and a parent, right, of children in the schools that wanted to understand the problem, called me up to schedule a meeting, and we went through it. And she had already read it multiple times and had all sorts of margin notes, and was using that as her effort to try to understand what's happening in this complicated system. And I think that's a different way you're trying to impact by slowly, organically trying to change the way that people understand what the nature of the problem is, and then analyze it in a more sophisticated way. And I would say that the work that we did on the Flint water crisis in the form of a report that was produced for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights when they were holding their hearings looking at the Flint crisis through the lens of structural racism had a deeper impact. Again, I think everybody knew what was happening in Flint was wrong. I don't think that there have been many deep analysis as why and how wrong it really was. And in a gratifying way, that report in some respects was used as a template for the initial framing of the criminal investigation. Because it really told the story of following the money and looking at the decision to approve the pipeline, look at how the pipeline was financed, look at the end of emergency management, look at Treasury, which nobody else was looking at. They were only looking at the Department of Health and Human Services. And you know, the criminal complaints went far beyond that because they quickly got access to lots of information that wasn't publicly available. But I think, again, setting the template for how to frame the issue work through the chronology that people hadn't worked through, link these notion of spatial structural racism with strategic racism that brings in a different lens, this idea of intent, and then kind of saying these are the people who need to be held accountable, and these are the institutions that have not yet been accountable, helped orient people who were already up in arms legitimately, who had all sorts of energy, and gave them, I think, a slightly different and broader frame to be introspection about what was happening, why it was happening, and how they might direct their efforts.
What is your impression? What is your impression of some of the movements that we're basically seeing right now, either at the state level or at the community level? I guess I'm trying to get an understanding of how you see this sort of panning out going forward, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, 5 years on, no change in policy. Yeah.
Detroit is full of amazing people. I keep saying that because it's just true, and we need to lift that up. And part of what makes them amazing is they hit the wall, they adapt, they change. They are not going to follow the same sort of tactics. So I think over the 5 years that the water struggle has gone on, you've also seen a whole bunch of new tactics being adopted, new strategies, and I think there has been substantial progress on the framing of the narrative, right? I think in the beginning, you were not hearing policymakers, you were not hearing journalists, you were not hearing members of the public just hitting that mantra of clean, safe, affordable water, right? And I think people use different formulas, and it's not the exact same thing, but I think that mantra, right, that kind of framing has made deeper inroads, right? And now people kind of nod their heads, right? It's not the first time they've heard it. There's a logic to it. They understand what it means. And so in terms of a broader narrative and understanding, I think that there has been a change, right? I think that the politics of Detroit are changing in a way that people are starting to realize, and part of this is saying, like the tax foreclosures. Now that we've gotten rid of 100,000 people, let's fix the system, right? And now that we've shut off water to 100,000 residents, well, maybe that's not the policy we really want to be associated with the city as we're cleaning up our image, right? So I think for different reasons, the politics may be shifting in ways that make local government more open to trying to think about more humane policies, right? That would be wonderful, right? But nobody should ever forget the 100,000 people in the last 5 years that have lost their home and have not had water for periods of time. So that, or that notion that mass displacement has a legacy, right? And that's been a very difficult thing to document. Not to get too far off topic, but we've made different efforts. Some journalistically, right? Some in terms of trying to write proposals that would do more substantial studies of the impact of fiscal austerity. But nobody knows where these people have gone, right? There's been no effort to track. There's been no effort to map. There's been no effort to look. And some moved around the city, so there's some kind of internal sort of movement. Some are in the housing market, sort of having black flight follow white flight. So there's some movement in the region. There's some exit from the region. But we don't have the answer to that question. So we have this reality of policies that are facilitating mass displacement, and yet we have no efforts to even begin to think about what has been the effect in terms of the social, political, demographic implications of those policies of mass displacement. And what I always tell my students, because there is a data component to human rights, right, that we collect data on things that we care about. Right? And therefore the absence of data on these issues, again, is reflective of the absence of caring. Right? But I do think, so we can't forget about the legacy of mass displacement. I do think that the micropolitics are changing in a way, and shame is one lever, right? Or saying that, maybe as we're trying to attract new, younger white people, we don't want to have bad press about water being shut off and tax foreclosures taking place, right? So the micropolitics, I think, could be changing. I think the more interesting, broader statewide change, and has national implications, is this reality of the unifying implications of water broadly defined. Water affordability, broadly defined to not just your bill in Detroit, but what are the implicit costs of septic systems and self-delivered water. The fact that there's an affordability component that is linking water issues across the state. There's certainly a safety and quality component that's linking water issues across the state. So I think that there is a kind of growing sort of awareness that there's a broad range and portfolio of issues around water that can unite different political factions in ways that could produce unifying change. Right? That's slow, right? I think progress has been made. Those things are fragile, right? But on a positive scenario, one could imagine that work continuing. Sometimes in complex systems, you get sort of rapid cascading forms of change that might lead to a radical statewide change in the way that we understand the relationship of the populace to clean, safe, affordable water, that by implication would have derivative implications for rural settings, for smaller cities, as well as for larger urban areas under a more unified frame. Right? And I think that would be, still forward-looking, still optimistic, still very tentative, but I think that dynamic is at play now in a way that was not at play 5 years ago, right? And part of that's the tactical changes, and these are intentional. These are smart, dedicated people working these issues that have looked for those opportunities, created those relationships, fostered that different way of thinking, right? And the other kind of potentially positive frame of foot is to be thinking in a more unified way about what water systems are, how the state should be regulating water systems, right? And again, these kind of things that most ordinary people, for understandable reasons, don't know. Water is not regulated like energy, right? So DTE is subject to all sorts of important controls, both on the environmental side, on a good day, and on the rate side that water is not, right? So water has been neglected in terms as an object of oversight, of control, of regulation, of thoughtfulness, right? And I think that there's a growing awareness that given the importance of water, given the complexity, given the heterogeneity, I mean, around the state, there's no two water systems are alike, and that's not a good thing, right? If you're trying to think about the obligations we have to protect public health, I think on that kind of more wonkish technocratic systems thinking, that there's way in which we can be more thoughtful in terms of what a water system looks like, what are the state rules that should govern a water system, and filling this kind of historic void where there hasn't been the same type of oversight, regulation, control, thoughtfulness again, as we might think about when we look at an electrical utility.
Sometimes one of the most important things that moves policy, or that policy can really gain from, is having that emotionally resonant quality, right? So reflecting on that, is there a particular person's story or an experience that you can recount, either that you've experienced yourself or that you've witnessed, that has moved you or inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, the people who have been brave enough to speak publicly are inspiring because they're doing that at often great personal risk. I would probably say the deeper form of inspiration that's happened for me has really been working with activists who have not given up. Right, and Mama Lila Cabell, who has passed recently, was a real warrior, and she would be at every water event, and the thoughtfulness, the intelligence, the care that she brought to that work was and is deeply inspiring. I think there's all sorts of people around the People's Water Board that weren't here just for this rodeo. They were here, going back 10, 15, 20 years around the water fight. I think of Sylvia Ordorno, right, as somebody who's just championing water everywhere in every space in a way that is fearless and brave. And this is not safe work. I mean, this is This is hard work. This is tiring work. This is exhausting work. And then I think of groups like We the People of Detroit and people like Monica Lewis-Patrick who are real generals, right, in terms of the strategy, right, the intensity, the intentionality. So I have really appreciated, learned from, respected just a whole wide range of people who are in this work so deep, so long. That to me is a lot of my inspiration, and I say that in all deference for the folks who are suffering daily, and with also particular respect for those that are standing up and making public stands where people need to realize that if you don't have water, Child Protective Services can take your kids, right? So there are very good reasons why you're not hearing a whole lot of personal narratives in this area, because it's dangerous for families. It's dangerous for parents to be telling these stories, right? But I think people interpret the absence of stories, right, as the absence of injury. And in this case, there's no way to conflate those two things. They shouldn't be conflated.